Welcome back to the next episode of TMT with Mike O'Reilly. My guest is Harold Furchtgott-Roth, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Harold, thanks so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to see you again and get in some really tough policy issues today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's always great to join you.
Why don't we start with some easy questions?
Sure.
Why don't you explain what you're doing as you left the commission, what's monopolized your time, and what insight interests you in the outside world since leaving the commission?
Oh, that's a lot of things since I left the commission. I wrote a book about the Telecommunications Act of 1996, a tough act to follow. I've had my own economic consulting firm, and now I'm also a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute. I head up the Center for the Economics of the Internet. I do some teaching on the side. I teach communications law at Brooklyn Law School, law and economics at the University of Baltimore. My colleague Kirk Arner and I are working on a textbook on communications law, and we're just about finished with the first draft. If you have any volunteers in the audience who want to read some chapters, I'm very interested in getting some outside readers.
Outstanding. Sounds like you enjoyed yourself since departing the commission.
Everything has been good.
Well, let's get into some policy issues, particularly
Sure.
a timely one, universal service.
Very timely, yes.
To stroll down memory lane, you and
Yes.
I had the pleasure of working on the 96 Act, as you referenced, many years ago. We were, obviously younger at the moment. And many of your recommendations, though, were key on the universal service sections on behalf of the late Chairman Tom Bliley. Your pieces, I vividly recall the language as it relates to reasonably comparable and explicit language, very vital to Section 254. But as someone who converted from a drafter to an implementer as you went to the commission, how do you think that the commission did in working on the broad section and also your specific additions?
Deep sigh. I'm sorry to say, I don't think the commission did very well. It's a difficult section to implement, but it seems like from day one the commission was doing things that are just not in the statute, deeply troubling things. So everything from multiple universal service funds, that's not in the statute, USAC. The commission has no authority to set up a Delaware corporation. Delegation to USAC, the commission has no authority to do that. The size of the funds, the focus outside of rural high costs. There were just a lot of things that, and then the complete failure to incorporate the states meaningfully in the 214 process, the failure to limit payments to carriers that are ATCs. There's so many things the commission got wrong over the years. It was difficult to know where to start.
Well, let's start with a more fundamental question, which has been kicked around since the language was adopted. Do you view universal service contributions as a tax? Why is it that some people seem to want to call it a fee instead of a tax? Is there any visible reason why that's beneficial?
As a commissioner, I said it was a tax. At least the way it was implemented, it should have been a fee. It should have been limited, and there should have been carriers should have been allowed to make contributions as payment in kind rather than necessarily contributing funds. But that's not the way the commission went, and then the commission set up these separate funds and established these percentage of revenue that carriers had to contribute. So it's difficult not to see it as a tax. There's an extensive discussion of that in the recent consumer research case in the Fifth Circuit.
So it seems to be, someone from the outside and then someone working at the commission, the decisions were shifted from commissioners to staff for multiple reasons. Is that a legitimate critique? And were those reasonable decisions that were made to isolate the oversight and management of universal service to staff and, as you mentioned, USAC?
Well, Commissioner, you may recall when we were both staffers, probably 6 months after the act passed, probably summer of '96, maybe fall, we had a conversation, collective House staff, Democrats and Republicans gathered in a conference room, and there was a staffer from the FCC, I don't even remember who it was, called and said, well, when Section 254 was drafted, was the intent of Congress to have, an X billion dollar fund or a 2X billion dollar fund or a 10X billion dollar fund, just enormous sums. And everyone, Democrat and Republican staffers, we looked at each other and we said, we're supposed to just be keeping the fund at roughly where it was. It wasn't to come up with this massive increase. And your point about the staff, as you know, there's a lot going on at the Commission. There's a lot of responsibility for staff, as there should be. FCC has great staff, and so that's not surprising. But I think the delegation ultimately to USAC is deeply troubling.
Why do you think that previous FCC chairs went in that direction? Were they afraid of public inspection and examination of the outcomes?
I don't know. I think you'd have to ask them. I wasn't involved in those decisions. I certainly was not the one. I remember when USAC was set up, there was Senator Stevens of Alaska requested a GAO study that focused on the question, does the FCC have the legal authority to set up USAC? And the answer was unambiguously no. And there was some settlement reached between Senator Stevens and the commission at the time that essentially the head of USAC at the time, I'm sure he's a perfectly wonderful person. I have no idea who he is other than he was politically connected, let's put it that way. He was getting a very nice salary as the head of USAC. So he left and the commission put in actually a very wonderful person, a good friend of mine, Cheryl Perino, to be the head of USAC. A thankless task. USAC in those days was a much more transparent organization. You could look at the annual report of USAC. You could go to the USAC website. You could find out how much different companies were contributing to USAC, how much they were getting out. You could see an awful lot about what's going on. And now you go to the website. You try to find out who's actually contributing what. Try to find out how many staff there are at USAC, trying to figure out what the budget of USAC is. It's probably there, but it's not easy to see. And I mean, part of it may be a recognition that to actually do all of the things that USAC would wind up doing would require a very large staff that is now, I don't even know, probably comparable in size to the FCC. It's a big organization.
You mentioned the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit and its recent decision striking the Universal Service Fund as unconstitutional. What did you think of that decision? You were engaged in some capacity, as I understand?
Yes, I was one of several people who wrote an amicus brief in support of consumers research and in their position that yes, so the Fifth Circuit found that it was both a tax and an unconstitutional delegation of taxing authority from Congress to the FCC, which then in turn subdelegated it to USAC. And so that was remanded back to the FCC for further consideration.
Do you envision that this case will be challenged in the Supreme Court? Are we going to see this play out in the next year, 2 years on what happens with universal service?
Well, Commissioner, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not here to offer legal opinions about that. But my understanding from my many friends who are lawyers that this will wind up before the Supreme Court.
And what did you think of the Fifth Circuit's decision? Did you agree on all their points? Were you surprised?
No, I agree. I think there are probably other things they could have said. But the general point about tax authority and delegation of tax authority, that made perfect sense to me. And it's actually quite consistent with my statements as a commissioner.
So if we get more towards the present time, recently the Commission has been engaged in expanding E-rate program, fund Wi-Fi hotspots, school buses. How do you see that squaring with the language in the statute, which talks about classrooms and libraries, elementary and secondary schools?
Educational institutions and libraries are very important parts of America. It's very important to educate the children of America. But it's also important to follow the law. And I think this is an area where the program has drifted very far from the statutory language. And the new efforts to include Wi-Fi hotspots as part of the E-rate program and school buses as part of the E-rate program. I find it very difficult to understand. I would point out, and you may remember this in conference, that the original language in the Senate bill was just schools. Classroom got added in conference, but in exchange, the House got Section 10 strengthened and Section 11 put in. So there was this exchange, if you will, this compromise that was reached. Well, Section 10 has never played out. Section 11 has never been implemented once, and yet we are probably $40 billion later on the schools and libraries program, and you have to wonder, where has all of this money gone? And now they want to add school buses and hotspots to it. I just don't see it, and it's just not in the statute. It's just not there.
Are you surprised that the E-rate budget is creeping up to the size of the high cost?
Well, it's been in the low $2 billion range for most of 25 years. It actually hasn't grown all that much, but I think they're having a hard time figuring out how to spend it. I'd also point out that the statutory language on schools and libraries is that schools shall receive a discount from essentially the prevailing cost of service from local carriers or from interstate carriers. There is no provision in the statute to come up with different discount rates for different categories of schools. That's something the Commission just invented. It's not in the statute. I mean, there's so many areas where the Commission's rules have no foundation in the statutory language. That's just one of many, many examples.
Is that a problem where Congress delegated too broad authority to the agency, or is it just the agency ignoring the limits that were put in the statute?
I think it's more of the latter. And let me be clear, there's a difference between an agency aggressively testing the limits of their authority and just how far outside of the statutory language they can go. And there may be good policy reasons for that. But, if you want an agency that simply says, we're just here to implement the law, we're going to stay narrowly within the language that Congress wrote, that has not been the FCC's approach to universal service.
Why do you think that the agency, our experience, I don't want to speak for you, but my experience certainly was that the agency was more afraid of Congress than willing to work with it? So if it had a desired policy objective from the chair, that they wanted to just move forward with it, notwithstanding the statute, rather than trying to negotiate with Congress and explain what the policy change would be and how it would impact, and then Congress can decide whether it should go forward with something or trade it for something else. I think that why do you think that the agency as a whole was unwilling to work with Congress?
It's a very good question. I don't have the answer to that. And you probably saw this more since you were on Capitol Hill during the first many years of the implementation. So you probably got a better sense of the Capitol Hill reaction to it. I think it varied from chair to chair and the particular people that the committees on Capitol Hill. I don't have a good answer for you on that.
So these days, there's, separate from the court case, there's been a conversation on, altering or reforming universal service. There's kind of two paths, right? There's the viewpoint that we should just fix contributions, in quotes, or that we should address contributions, distribution, and administration. Do you have a favored path?
For a long time, I've favored contribution reform. I think basing it on interstate telecommunications revenue has been, in my view, obsolete for 20 years or more now. It's just a dwindling revenue base that ultimately today primarily gets paid for by wireless customers. And very few wireless customers actually look at their bill and sort of see, well, there's this universal service fee charge here, and then occasionally there's something called regulatory fee, which is who knows exactly what that is. But what we do know is that the current contribution base, the fee charge has been anywhere from the high 20s up to 35% now for several years. I just think that's unsustainable, and for the FCC as doing this without any direct statutory authority from Congress, I think is deeply troubling. One approach that I recommended and worked on for many years was a numbers-based solution. Right now, numbers are free. A lot of numbers are actually used overseas. A lot of numbers are used out of Russia and probably China. So there's no reason why you couldn't have a fee placed on numbers that would actually help with some of the number problems and get rid of some illegitimate users of North American numbers. Other people have other approaches, connection space, which I think is a little bit more complicated, and I'm not quite sure about the FCC statutory authority, whereas numbers, unambiguously, the statute makes very clear the FCC is in charge of numbering administration. But at least in terms of contribution, I think there needs to be some substantial reform there. And that should frankly be combined with some clear authority from Congress about the size and setting the limits on exactly what this program is all about. The other parts that you mentioned on the administration, essentially USAC, and the size of the funds, those are issues that also should probably be addressed. I find the entire USAC structure, I'm sure there are wonderful people there. It's all been very well-intentioned and all, but it would be nice to have some clear congressional authority for that.
Do you agree with those that argue you have to do them as a whole rather than splitting off the pieces? I'm having a tough time figuring out how you can do one without the other.
I'm sure you're right about that. I think there are things that the commission could do on its own, and then there are things that would absolutely require congressional authority. And the preferred path would be for Congress to just do this. But then there's a question of what do you do if Congress cannot or will not act?
If there's a working group on Capitol Hill, it may not exactly be representative of all the different views. Mm-hmm. What is your take on how long Congress would have to take to to resolve universal service reform? How long would you envision that Congress could tackle this before we knew that they were getting somewhere or weren't getting somewhere?
Commissioner, I think you are a much closer observer of Capitol Hill than I am. I would hope that this is something that Congress can tackle. It's something that Congress should tackle. But there are a lot of difficult issues. But it's something, I'm glad there are working groups, and they, to some extent, I would say they just need to make some decisions. Don't strive for perfection, but just try to get something that is workable and have the commission operate inside the law rather than having the commission operate outside of the law.
Do you think there's other structures that'd be helpful to Congress? People talk about a blue ribbon, panel or blue ribbon commission or outside experts to try and help them come up with recommendations, since they have so much on their plate. Even though they may not be able to get to final resolution, they are working really hard.
Yeah.
When I talk to friends on Capitol Hill, there is a lot of activity. While it may not represent new law, it seems like this is one of those areas where they could benefit from having, not a delegation, but recommendations from people who've been engaged on these issues in the past.
I don't have a strong view one way or another. I have, as you do. I mean, we both have worked on Capitol Hill. You become incredibly respectful of just how important statutory language is. It's so difficult to get it there, and whatever is needed to get Congress to actually come up with improved universal service language would be a good thing. Exactly what process that is, I don't know.
Do you feel that the decisions that have been on universal service by the FCC over the last many decades has eroded the trust in Congress, in the agency? I mean, I remember the 96 Act, and there was a belief that they would do the right thing, that you could trust them, and you would have conversations, and you believe it's going in the right direction. That has eroded in some respects. Do you think that's problematic, and that the agency will that the Congress will have to be much more specific, not only to survive court review and making sure that it's, that whatever the agency does is directed by Congress, but also the belief in that the Congress's views are going to actually be reflected in the decisions that are made at the agency?
Commissioner, that's a very interesting observation. I haven't thought about it in those terms, but I'm sure you're right that when the 96 Act was being drafted, I think there was a lot of confidence in the agency, and that it would follow precisely the statutory language. And in some things they did. I have to say, the deadlines on making the rulemakings, a lot of us were a little skeptical that they would make the deadlines, but they did. But the direction of the rulemakings, the following what the statutory language actually said instead of coming up with things that were dramatically different, that has not, I'm sure that's lessened confidence in the FCC from a lot of folks on Capitol Hill.
Did you have the pleasure of working on the joint boards that the agency and with the state? I chaired a number of those boards over there. I did have difficulty, I will admit, over some decisions that you mentioned numbers.
Yes.
Connections.
Yes.
I took over the joint board in the middle of some of those conversations that had been presupposed on the directions that they wanted to go, and I could never shake them from the decisions, from the viewpoints that they had, and to look at numbers. Couldn't get the staff to look at numbers seriously.
Right.
Do the joint boards work in your? I certainly have a skeptical. Should we come up with it? I'm not saying that it shouldn't be state input, but the joint boards themselves don't. In my opinion, didn't work as intended.
My experience was probably a little different. I was on the Joint Board on Universal Service when I was commissioner. I think the Joint Board worked pretty well, but then the commission just ignored the recommendations. And I think that kind of eroded the trust that the states had in the FCC. The role of the states, as you know better than anyone, in the 96 Act was substantial, and the word intrastate service appears dozens and dozens of times, and the role of the states appears frequently, and there was the whole 214 process for eligible telecommunications carriers. And then I think to some extent the Iowa Utilities Board decision took a lot of the wind out of the state role, where the Supreme Court essentially said there are no more intrastate services. I'm not sure that was the right decision, but that's what the Supreme Court found. So the states have had a diminished role in telecommunications policy in the past 20, 25 years. I think that's unfortunate because there's still a lot that goes on at the state and local level, and they're just not very engaged right now. And the joint board process, in my view, has never worked, even though there's a requirement for a joint board. There's a requirement for the commission to act on joint board recommendations within, I think it's 12 or 15 months by statute. Never happens. And by the time you were on the joint board, probably the states were probably both frustrated and not looking for reasonable solutions, given they knew the FCC was going to ignore them anyways. It's not a good situation.
You mentioned the legal side of state authority or involvement eroding.
Yes.
Did technology also play a bigger part?
Yes.
People look back and say the 96 Act worked or didn't work, depending on your viewpoint. But overlaying that was a massive expansion of I'll call it the internet.
Yes.
And when I shifted roles from the House to the Senate, I was engaged in internet telephony, then called VoIP.
Yes.
Which is completely revolutionized the marketplace.
Right.
And shifted what the architecture looks like, the infrastructure looks like, and also the regulatory ramifications. Did technology have a huge role in shifting to where we are today?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And there's some people who would say 254 was written in a world of circuit switch telephony, and it's awkward to use the same language in an internet world where communications are internet-based. So that's been a real problem. And some of the language in Section 254 because it refers to both advanced telecommunication services and information services as two distinct things, has had some interpretations, I'll put it that way, on the network neutrality debate. Yes, and that's also an area where it would be helpful if Congress could readdress universal service. I'm not quite sure that the Commission also had the authority to change funding for away from telephony services to purely broadband services. I think that's quite a stretch of Section 254.
When you look out what you might see 5 to 10 years from now, how do you envision USF changing? If Congress has modernized the authority, what would the telecommunications industry, strict telecom, is shrinking.
Yes.
And other industries are expanding. And are we going to continue to have a difficulty with USF and the spending side of the equation that no longer makes any sense?
That's quite true. And I know there are folks on Capitol Hill who kind of look at the BEAD program, this massive $42 billion program. And let's set aside for the moment the implementation of that program and just look at the question of congressional spending done through the appropriations process, which BEAD is, versus the FCC Universal Service Fund program, which is not done through congressional authorization, not done through the appropriations process, just done through the FCC. And there are folks on Capitol Hill who look at that and sort of say, well, maybe it makes more sense to just bring this all back into the congressional spending process. I don't know what the right answer is on that, but I think if you look ahead, it's reasonable to wonder whether the current U.S. Universal Service Program is stable and sustainable in its current form, and that's not good. That's not good.
When you look at the agency itself, your former employer, mine as well,
yeah,
do you see a vision where it has longevity? I've given that speech that the industries that are regulated are shrinking, and Congress has not been favorable of giving them authority over new fields. It's not going to be the AI regulator. It's not going to be the internet regulator. At least that seems quite solid. So the universe of the services that it regulates today are shrinking, and it's longevity seems some trouble. Do you agree with that sentiment, or am I off? Am I crazy?
Well, first of all, you're not crazy, Commissioner. That absolutely certain you're not crazy. I think what we've seen actually in the past few years is sort of a diminished role for the agency. It's not as likely to appear on the front pages of newspapers as it was several years when you were on the commission. I think it was much more frequently in the news than it is today. It still has important roles, I'd say, particularly in the wireless world and in the satellite world, essentially licensing issues that responsibility isn't going to go away. But if you look at, say, something like universal service, that if not go away, it could be substantially reshaped by Congress in some different direction. And I think there's also a question of long-term, if universal service stays in its current structure, or if there's spending that goes on through the FCC, whether that continues to be done through USAC or whether USAC actually gets brought in-house inside of the FCC and what that would look like.
Would you rather USAC be internal or as it is today, or as I've argued that it should be part of make it contractual relationship. It can be third party, with blessing by Congress, and you can have very strong requirements on a contractual basis that don't exist today.
I think you could do either way, but let's make it consistent with the law instead of just, a Delaware corporation set up by the FCC. It's just, when you just say those words, you just sort of say, how can that possibly be? How can that possibly be?
Do you have any parting thoughts on where this debate goes? We're in the middle of reforming USF. We talked about what the future may be in a declining industry. Any last thoughts on the state of universal service and what has happened over your time period?
One point we haven't discussed, which I think is important, is, and you and I were both there during the deliberations on the 96 Act, and the Senate had the farm team, and they would come in their T-shirts, the farm team, and somehow I think the rural interests have gotten, if not completely lost, I think diminished in a lot of the debates that have been going on in the universal service. And the focus of attention has been on other issues that are frankly not in the statute, or certainly not there. And the concept of rural universal service in the mid-1990s was just advanced circuit switch technology. Could be the same in Manhattan as it was in the most rural parts of the country. That's very different in an internet world, and how you deal with that in an internet world is a challenge. And I think you can look at the Section 254 and hold it up and try to find how to deal with that in an internet world, and it's hard to see. And so I think that's a topic that Congress needs to sort out.
You raise a very important point, and one I referenced early on: reasonably comparable. Does a household in New York City and the service it gets have to be identical to should it be the same in the middle of Iowa, or there has to be this there's this argument right now that everyone deserves fiber,
right?
And I just
I mean it's well, we tried to avoid the BEAD program, but it's no, it needs to be reasonably comparable. But $42.5 billion. That is a massive amount of money. That's as much or close to as much as the entire schools and libraries program over the past 25 years. And it's a very large amount of money. And to do fiber in areas that wireless or satellite could do much better makes no sense to me. I just think it's and it's not consistent with the statutory language.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there with the last word. I want to thank you so very much. I really appreciate your insights on this important topic.
Sure,
I hope that we'll be engaged in the future in some capacity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.